What if Africa had never heard the word colony? Imagine, not a single European with a monocle and a cup of tea in hand, proudly proclaiming, "This land is now mine because I said so." No lines on a map drawn with a ruler over dinner in Berlin in 1884, when gentlemen in top hats shared the continent like a birthday cake. It sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? We are all used to thinking that the history of Africa is a history of struggle against those who came to civilize it by force. But what if this had not happened at all? What if Africa had been its own master, without anyone else's rules, without anyone else's borders, without anyone deciding that elephants belonged to Queen Victoria? Let's imagine this world for a moment. I did not just pull the topic, what if Africa had not been colonized, out of my hat like a magician at a fair? This question is a real treasure for those who like to dig into history and reflect. What if everything had gone differently? History, my friends, is not just a set of dates and boring facts that we crammed at school. It is a huge puzzle where one small piece can change the whole picture. And Africa is one of those pieces that Europeans once decided to reshape to their liking. But imagine that this did not happen. What would have happened then? Would we now be drinking coffee from Ethiopian plantations, run not by British lords but by local chiefs? Would we be wearing fabrics from Mali and Paris instead of Mali wearing Parisian laws? This idea is interesting not only because it challenges everything we know about the past. It makes us wonder, how would we live today if someone hadn't decided to play Monopoly with an entire continent? The irony is that those who drew the borders often hadn't even been to Africa. Imagine an architect building a house without knowing where the foundation is. So sit back, grab your coffee, maybe that Ethiopian coffee, and let's travel to an alternative history together. Ahead is a story that is hard to put down, with unexpected twists and turns, light humor, and a couple of thoughts that will be buzzing around in your head for a long time. Are you ready? Then let's go. So, let's imagine a world where Africa has never become a trophy for anyone. There are no Portuguese who first landed on the shores of Ghana in the 15th century, no Belgians who turned the Congo into their personal nightmare, and definitely no British who decided that they desperately needed every other piece of land from Cairo to Cape Town. What is happening instead? Let's start with the fact that Africa is not a monolith, but a continent with hundreds of cultures, empires, and peoples who have been trading, fighting, and building their own worlds for centuries. Without the colonial boot, these worlds not only survive, they thrive. The first twist? The great African empires, such as Mali, Songhai, or Zulu, did not collapse under the pressure of outsiders. Imagine the Malian Empire in the 15th century, a wealth that dwarfed Europe, when Mansa Musa distributed gold in Cairo so generously that the local economy nearly collapsed from shock. Without colonization, this state would not have crumbled after his rule. Instead of Europeans exporting gold by ship, Mali invested it in its own development. Trade routes across the Sahara become an African version of the Silk Road, with caravans carrying not only gold and salt, but also ideas, technology, and books. Meanwhile, Europe is still debating whether the earth is flat, and Mali is already building libraries in Timbuktu, which attracts scientists from all over the world. Ironically, while Columbus was discovering America, African merchants already knew where to find spices in India and did not need intermediaries from Lisbon. Next up was East Africa. Without the Portuguese, who destroyed the Swahili trade, coastal cities like Mombasa or Zanzibar become centers of global trade. Imagine Arab, Indian, and Chinese ships docking in the ports, and Swahili merchants dictating prices for spices, ivory, and fabrics. The Chinese admiral Zheng He, who sailed to Africa in the 15th century, didn't just leave a note in his diary saying, "There are giraffes here," but made long-term deals. The result? East Africa becomes an economic hub connecting Asia and the Mediterranean, and Europeans, when they finally wake up, find that they are simply not in the game. A joke on the topic. Imagine the King of Portugal writing a letter to the Sultan of Zanzibar. "May we have a little trade?" And the latter replies, "Excuse me, we already have partners who don't shoot their guns when things go wrong." And what about the north? Egypt, which in the real world became a battleground between the Ottomans, the French, and the British, here remains an independent heir to the pharaohs. Without Napoleon, who brought his cannons to the pyramids, and without the British, who in the 19th century saved the Suez Canal for themselves, Egypt is developing its own maritime empire. Imagine Cairo's engineers improving navigation on the Nile and a navy that controls trade from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. It is ironic that when Europe finally wakes up to the idea of canals, Egypt already has a network of waterways that transport goods faster than any steamer from London. And the famous phrase, "He who controls Suez controls the world," could be translated as, "He who is friends with Cairo does not stand in line for spices." What about technology? Without colonial depletion of resources, Africa does not become a raw material appendage. Imagine that Congolese tribes, who knew how to smelt iron before the Europeans arrived, developed metallurgy. Or that Ethiopian engineers, building on the traditions of the Axum Empire, invent their own mechanical wonders. Instead of exporting diamonds and copper, Africa processes them itself. In the 18th century, when Europe launches the Industrial Revolution, Africa keeps up but does so on its own terms. There is no need for a white man with a steam engine, because local craftsmen are already building roads and bridges that serve trade, not war. Culture. Oh, this is where the real show begins. Without colonial oppression, African religions, art, and languages do not recede into the background. Imagine that instead of French cathedrals in Senegal, there are temples of local beliefs, and in Nigeria, Yoruba literature flourishes, read from Lagos to Brazil. Music and dance, which in the real world became the basis of jazz or samba through the slave trade, remain part of African life, and perhaps it is Europeans who travel to Côte d'Ivoire to learn rhythms, not vice versa. An ironic moment. Imagine Beethoven writing a symphony inspired by Ghanaian drums and calling it African. Who would have thought that Vienna would become a fan of African melodies? New paragraph. And what about the south of the continent? Without the Dutch and the British there to wage their drills and diamond battles, peoples like the Zulu and the Xhosa are creating their own powerful states. Imagine a Zulu kingdom that instead of fighting colonizers, expands its influence through trade and diplomacy. Diamonds and gold, which in the real world have become a curse due to the greed of outsiders, are transformed into capital for development. Cities like modern Johannesburg emerge not as colonies of miners, but as centers of African architecture and crafts. A joke on the topic: imagine a British lord arriving in Cape Town with a proposal to help with the economy and being politely told, "Thank you, but our diamonds are already in the necklace, not in your crown." But not everything is so smooth. Without colonization, Africa does not avoid conflicts. Empires fight each other, as they always have. The Zulu are expanding their territories, Mali is arguing with Songhai for control of the Sahara, and Ethiopia is fighting back against its neighbors. However, these wars do not leave the continent in ruins, because there is no external force that would add fuel to the fire for its own benefit. And here's an unexpected twist. By the 19th century, Africa was uniting in powerful alliances, not through coercion, but through trade and diplomacy. Imagine an African Union of States that dictates terms to Europe and America. When the First World War breaks out in Europe in 1914, Africa does not get involved in the carnage as a colony. It acts as a mediator, selling resources to both sides and laughing at how the civilized world is destroying itself. How would this affect the present? Without the colonial legacy, there are no artificial borders that tear peoples in half, no trauma from slavery, no economic dependence. Africa in the 21st century is a continent with strong states, where Nigeria could be a technological giant, Kenya a leader in green technologies, and South Africa the cultural capital of the world. The irony is that Europe might still be trying to catch up with a dark continent that turned out not to be so dark when given the chance to shine on its own. So, where have we come to in this alternative history? Africa, which has never known colonial yoke, becomes not just a player on the world stage, it sets the tone. Imagine a world where the UN meets in Addis Ababa, not New York, where Hollywood stars wear clothes from Lagos designers, not Milan, and where instead of aid to Africa, we hear about African investment in Europe. Sound like a fantasy? Maybe so, but this exercise in what if shows how fragile our reality is. One twist in the story, and everything we consider normal is thrown to the winds. This story is not just a game of imagination. It makes us wonder, what have we lost because of the greed and pride of a few great men with monoculars? Maybe if Africa had its way, we would all be living in a world where wealth and culture are distributed a little more fairly. Or maybe we would just drink better coffee. Who knows? The irony is that in that alternative world, I would probably be sitting in a cafe in Timbuktu right now, not writing this to you. And by the way, they would definitely serve better tea than the one King George drank while his generals were dividing Africa into pieces. What do you think, friends? Did you enjoy thinking about such what-ifs? Then give us a like. It's a signal that you like such historical experiments. And subscribe, because there are many more stories ahead that are hard to put down. Let's figure out together how history would have turned out if someone had made a different choice. See you in the next story. Hold your coffee tight, because we will turn the world upside down more than once.